The morning fog settled thick over Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, the kind that made the cypress trees look like ghosts rising from black water. Detective Raymond Boudreau stood at the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, watching search boats cut through the murky channels, their searchlights piercing the pre-dawn darkness. They were looking for 17-year-old Jackson Whitley, a local fishing guide's son who'd vanished 3 days earlier while checking crawfish traps in the deeper sections of the swamp. Raymond had worked missing persons cases before, plenty of them. But something about this one settled wrong in his gut. The boy knew these waters better than most grown men, had been navigating them since he could walk. His pirogue was found capsized near Blind Man's Bend, but there was no sign of struggle, no blood, nothing that explained why an experienced waterman would simply disappear into the marsh. The Whitley family had deep roots in this parish, going back 6 generations to when the Acadian exiles first settled the bayou country and learned to make a living from land that most people considered worthless. Jackson's father, Claude Whitley, ran a bait shop and guiding service out of a weathered building on stilts that overlooked Bayou Lafourche. His mother, Diana, taught elementary school in the nearby town of Houma. They were good people, church-going folks who never expected tragedy to visit their door. Raymond had known Claude since they were boys, fishing the same channels, catching the same catfish, and sharing the same stories their grandfathers had passed down about the swamp's temperament and moods. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers around the world. By the 5th day of searching, the volunteer boats had covered nearly 40 square miles of wetland. They dragged sections of deeper water, checked abandoned hunting camps, and followed every lead that came through the tip line Raymond had established. The Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries brought in specialized equipment, sonar devices that could scan the murky bottom where visibility dropped to 0 just inches beneath the surface. Nothing. It was as if Jackson had been swallowed by the earth itself. Diana Whitley stopped sleeping, her eyes hollowed out with exhaustion and grief. She sat in the kitchen of their modest home, surrounded by neighbors bringing casseroles and prayers, but Raymond could see she was already mourning, already preparing herself for the worst possible outcome. Claude refused to accept it. He went out every morning before dawn, searching the same channels over and over, convinced his son was out there somewhere, injured maybe, waiting to be found. The community rallied in the way that small bayou towns do when one of their own goes missing. Fishermen postponed their commercial runs to join the search. Teachers from Diana's school organized prayer vigils. The local Catholic Church held a special Mass, and Father Thibodeau spoke about faith in the darkest hours. But as the days stretched into weeks, the search efforts began to wind down. The official teams pulled back their resources. The story moved from the front page of the Houma Courier to a small column in the back sections. Life in Terrebonne Parish continued its rhythm, the tide coming in and going out, the crawfish season transitioning to shrimping season, the summer heat building toward the hurricane months. Raymond kept the case file open on his desk, reviewing it during slow afternoons, but even he had to admit the trail had gone completely cold. 3 months after Jackson's disappearance, Raymond attended a retirement party for one of the senior detectives in the parish sheriff's office. People drank beer, told old war stories about cases solved and criminals caught, but Raymond found himself standing alone on the back porch, staring out toward the darkening tree line where the swamp began. A fellow detective named Louis Arsenault joined him, a cigarette dangling from his lips. They talked about Jackson Whitley, about the strange nature of the case, about how sometimes the swamp just takes what it wants and never gives it back. Louis mentioned other disappearances over the years, people who'd gone into those wetlands and never returned. Most were outsiders, tourists who underestimated the danger. But Jackson had been different. He belonged to this place. His vanishing felt like a violation of some unspoken contract between the people and the land. A full year passed. Diana Whitley returned to teaching, though her colleagues said she seemed to be moving through life like a sleepwalker, present but not really there. Lord kept the bait shop running, but the light had gone out of him. He stopped guiding fishing trips, couldn't bring himself to take clients into the same waters that had claimed his son. Raymond checked in on them every few weeks, always hoping he might have news, but there was never anything new to report. The case remained open, unsolved, a painful mystery that hung over the entire community like the Spanish moss that draped from the cypress branches. Then the years began to accumulate. 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Jackson Whitley became a cautionary tale, a ghost story told around campfires, another name added to the long list of people who'd been swallowed by the Atchafalaya Basin and never seen again. Raymond retired from the sheriff's office after 28 years of service. He bought a small camp house on the edge of the swamp, spending his days fishing and trying not to think too much about the cases he'd never solved. But Jackson Whitley haunted him. The boy's face, smiling from the missing person posters that had yellowed and faded over the years, appeared in his dreams sometimes. Raymond would wake in the early hours, listening to the frogs and night birds, wondering if he'd missed something, some crucial detail that might have made all the difference. Claude Whitley died of a heart attack when Jackson had been missing for 12 years. The funeral was well attended, a somber affair where people spoke in hushed tones about a good man who'd been broken by loss. Diana sat in the front pew, her face composed but distant, and Raymond wondered how she'd found the strength to keep going all these years. 15 years after Jackson Whitley disappeared, a team of archaeologists from Louisiana State University arrived in Terrebonne Parish with a permit to excavate what they believed might be a significant Native American mound complex deep in the swamp. The site had been identified through aerial surveys and ground-penetrating radar, showing what appeared to be a large earthwork structure that predated European contact. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Patricia Nguyen, explained to the local press that Louisiana had some of the oldest mound sites in North America, ancient ceremonial and burial structures built by indigenous peoples thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt. This particular site was unusual because it appeared to be a flat-topped pyramid structure similar to those found at other Mississippian culture sites, but it was located in a remote section of wetland that had remained largely unexplored. The excavation team established a base camp on a rare patch of high ground, using airboats to transport equipment and personnel through the maze of channels and cypress stands. Dr. Nguyen assembled a crew of graduate students and specialists in pre-Columbian archaeology, eager to document whatever they might find. The mound itself rose about 20 feet above the surrounding swamp, covered in dense vegetation that had to be carefully cleared away. Initial surveys confirmed it was indeed an ancient structure, constructed from thousands of tons of earth carried by hand and shaped with incredible precision. The team began systematic excavation, working in careful grid patterns, documenting every layer, every artifact, every piece of charcoal that might provide radiocarbon dating. 3 weeks into the dig, a graduate student named Rebecca Chang was working on the southern face of the mound when her trowel struck something that didn't feel like earth or stone. She called Dr. Nguyen over, and together they carefully excavated around the anomaly. What emerged was the corner of what appeared to be a sealed chamber, constructed from limestone blocks that had been fitted together with remarkable skill. This was extraordinary. The indigenous mound builders of Louisiana typically didn't use cut stone in their constructions. This technique was more consistent with Central American pyramid building. The team expanded their excavation carefully, revealing that the chamber was approximately 8 feet square, sealed on all sides, with no apparent entrance. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed it was hollow inside. Dr. Nguyen contacted the Louisiana Office of Cultural Development and the Tunica Biloxi tribe, seeking guidance on how to proceed. After consultation with tribal elders and state archaeologists, permission was granted to carefully open the chamber, with the understanding that everything would be documented and any human remains would be treated with the utmost respect. The team spent 2 days preparing, setting up cameras, ensuring proper documentation protocols. When they finally removed one of the limestone blocks, creating an opening large enough to see inside, Dr. Nguyen shined a powerful flashlight into the darkness. What she saw made her gasp and step backward. Inside the chamber, sitting against the far wall, was the body of a young man. He was mummified, preserved by the sealed environment, wearing modern clothing, jeans, a saint's t-shirt, work boots. The discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological team. This wasn't an ancient burial. This was something else entirely, something impossible. Dr. Nguyen immediately contacted the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office, explaining that they'd found what appeared to be human remains of recent origin inside a sealed pre-Columbian burial chamber. The forensics team arrived by helicopter, along with the current chief of detectives, a young woman named Gabrielle Landry, who'd grown up hearing stories about the infamous Jackson Whitley case. When they carefully removed the body from the chamber and examined it more closely, Gabrielle felt her heart begin to race. The clothing, though faded and deteriorated, matched descriptions from the missing person report. The work boots had the distinctive pattern of a local manufacturer, but it was the wallet found in the back pocket of the jeans that confirmed the impossible truth. Inside the wallet was a Louisiana driver's license issued to Jackson Thomas Whitley, with an expiration date from 15 years ago. There was a school ID from Terrebonne High School, a photo of Jackson with his parents, $43 in cash, and a receipt from Claude's Bait and Tackle dated 3 days before the boy's disappearance. Gabrielle stood in the humid shade of the cypress trees, holding the evidence bag containing that wallet, trying to make sense of what they'd found. The sealed chamber had been constructed centuries, possibly millennia ago. The limestone blocks weighed hundreds of pounds each. There was no conceivable way Jackson Whitley could have entered that space, and there was absolutely no way someone could have placed him inside and then sealed it from the outside without leaving any trace of disturbance. The forensic anthropologist who examined the body confirmed that the mummification was natural, a result of the sealed environment and the particular mineral content of the soil. The remains showed no signs of trauma, no broken bones, no evidence of violence. Cause of death was impossible to determine after 15 years, but there was nothing to suggest foul play. What disturbed the investigators most was the position of the body. Jackson hadn't been placed there after death. His posture suggested he'd been sitting, perhaps resting when he died. One hand was extended toward the sealed entrance, as if he'd been trying to push his way out. The other hand clutched something small, a carved wooden figurine in the shape of a crawfish, the kind of folk art that local craftsmen sold to tourists. On the back of the figurine, barely visible, were 3 initials: C.W.W. Claude William Whitley. The news spread through Terrebonne Parish like wildfire. Jackson Whitley had been found, but the circumstances of his discovery raised more questions than answers. Reporters descended on the small community, drawn by the bizarre nature of the story. National news outlets picked it up, running segments about the boy who'd disappeared in the swamp and been found 15 years later inside a sealed ancient pyramid. Theories proliferated online and in coffee shops throughout the region. Some people suggested supernatural explanations, that the swamp itself had claimed Jackson for some unknowable purpose. Others proposed elaborate conspiracy theories involving secret chambers and hidden entrances. The archaeological community was in an uproar, with experts from across the country demanding access to the site, wanting to understand how a sealed pre-Columbian structure could contain modern human remains. Diana Whitley was 73 years old when they brought her the news. She'd never remarried, never left the small house she'd shared with Claude and Jackson. Over the years, she'd transformed Jackson's bedroom into a shrine, keeping everything exactly as he'd left it that last morning. The unmade bed, the fishing magazines on the nightstand, the collection of lures and hooks organized in a tackle box. When Gabriel Landry arrived at her door, Diana already knew. Something in the detective's expression, the careful way she asked to come inside, told her that the long wait was finally over. She listened to the details with an expression of profound calm, as if she'd been preparing for this moment for a decade and a half. When Gabriel finished explaining, Diana asked only one question. Did he suffer? The detective couldn't answer that with any certainty, so she simply said, "We don't believe so." The funeral was held 3 weeks later, after the state medical examiner released the remains. Jackson Whitley was laid to rest in the cemetery behind St. Joseph's Catholic Church, in a plot next to his father. Half the parish attended, along with reporters and curiosity seekers from across the state. Father Thibodeau, now elderly and moving slowly, presided over the service. He spoke about mysteries beyond human understanding, about faith in the face of questions that have no earthly answers. Diana sat in the front row, flanked by old friends and distant relatives, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes dry. She'd done her crying over the past 15 years. Now there was only the strange comfort of closure, incomplete and unsatisfying as it was. Dr. Nguyen's team continued their excavation of the mound site, but under much stricter oversight from state and federal authorities. The sealed chamber became the focus of intense study. Carbon dating of organic materials from the chamber's construction confirmed it had been sealed approximately 200 years ago, during the height of the Coles Creek culture, a Mississippian period society that had built elaborate ceremonial centers throughout Louisiana. Yet there was no question that the chamber had been sealed continuously since its construction. The limestone blocks showed no evidence of being moved or disturbed. The mortar between them, analyzed in multiple laboratories, was consistent with pre-Columbian techniques and materials. It was, by every measurable standard, impossible. A retired anthropology professor from Tulane University named Dr. Howard Klein became obsessed with the case. He'd spent 40 years studying the indigenous cultures of the lower Mississippi Valley, and the Jackson Whitley discovery challenged everything he thought he knew. He interviewed Diana, reviewed all the police records, examined the archaeological reports, and spent weeks at the mound site studying every detail of the chamber's construction. In the end, he published a controversial paper suggesting that there might be natural geological processes at work, that the mound could have contained hidden cavities or channels that periodically opened and closed due to seismic activity or groundwater movement. It was a theory that satisfied no one, least of all Dr. Klein himself, who privately admitted to colleagues that he was simply trying to impose rational order on something that defied rational explanation. Raymond Boudreau, now in his late 70s and dealing with the early stages of Parkinson's disease, read about Jackson's discovery in the newspaper. He sat in his camp house, the article spread across the kitchen table, and tried to reconcile what he was reading with his 30 years of investigative experience. He'd built his career on logic, on evidence, on the careful assembly of facts that led to reasonable conclusions. This case offered no such comfort. He thought about that morning 15 years ago when he'd stood at the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, watching the search boats, certain that they'd find the boy eventually. He thought about Claude Whitley, dead without ever knowing what happened to his son. He thought about all the theories he'd entertained over the years: accidental drowning, foul play, running away. None of them had prepared him for this. Gabriel Landry, driven by the same need for answers that had defined Raymond's career, continued investigating even after the case was officially closed as a death by undetermined causes. She interviewed everyone who'd known Jackson, reviewed his school records, talked to his friends from high school. What emerged was the portrait of a quiet, introspective young man who'd loved the swamp with an almost spiritual intensity. His teachers described him as a daydreamer, someone who seemed more comfortable in nature than in classroom settings. His friends said he sometimes talked about feeling called to the water, about hearing voices in the wind that moved through the cypress branches. One former girlfriend, now married with children of her own, remembered Jackson telling her about vivid dreams he'd been having in the weeks before his disappearance. Dreams of walking through ancient structures hidden in the swamp, of finding doorways that led to places outside of time. None of it explained anything. Gabrielle compiled all her findings into a comprehensive report that she knew would never be satisfactory, could never be satisfactory, because the central question remained unanswerable. How did Jackson Whitley end up inside a chamber that had been sealed for more than a millennium? She thought about the wooden crawfish figurine he'd been clutching, carved by his father, a connection to home that he'd held on to even in death. She thought about the positioning of his body, the extended hand reaching toward the sealed entrance. Had he known where he was? Had he understood what was happening to him? Or had he simply found himself in darkness, confused and afraid, calling out for help that would never come? The archaeological site was eventually closed to excavation after the chamber was fully documented and the mound was restored as closely as possible to its original state. The Tunica Biloxi tribe requested that it be designated as a protected cultural site, and the state agreed. A small marker was placed at the access point, explaining the historical significance of the mound complex, but making no mention of Jackson Whitley. That story became something else, a local legend that tourists occasionally asked about when they took swamp tours through the Atchafalaya Basin. The guides would tell it in hushed tones, adding their own embellishments, turning tragedy into entertainment. The facts were strange enough without exaggeration, but facts rarely satisfied people who wanted neat explanations and tidy endings. Diana Whitley lived for another 7 years after her son's funeral. In that time, she never spoke publicly about what had happened, declining all interview requests from journalists and documentary filmmakers. She continued teaching until she was 80, finally retiring to the small house that held so many memories. Her former students would see her sometimes, sitting on the porch in the early evening, staring out toward the tree line where the swamp began. They wondered what she was thinking, whether she'd found any peace. The truth was more complicated. Diana had spent 15 years preparing herself for the possibility that Jackson was dead. She'd even, in her darkest moments, prepared herself for the possibility that he'd been murdered. But she'd never prepared herself for mystery, for an ending that offered no understanding, no lesson, no meaning that she could extract and hold on to. On the 15th anniversary of Jackson's discovery, Gabrielle Landry returned to the mound site. Access was restricted, but she still had her credentials, and the park ranger who managed the protected area was willing to let her through. She walked the same path the archaeologists had cut through the swamp, now overgrown with new vegetation. The mound rose before her, green and ancient, holding its secrets. She thought about all the people this case had touched, the family destroyed by loss, the community traumatized by mystery, the scientists whose understanding of the world had been challenged. She thought about Jackson Whitley, 17 years old, his whole life ahead of him, somehow finding himself in a place that shouldn't have existed, dying alone in darkness. The sun was setting when Gabrielle finally left the site, the sky turning the particular shade of orange and purple that only happens in the deep south. She drove back through the parish, past the bait shop that had closed years ago, past the church where Jackson was buried, past the school where Diana had taught generations of children. Life continued here, as it always did, the rhythms of the bayou proceeding regardless of human tragedy or mystery. The story of Jackson Whitley shocked the world for a brief moment, made headlines and sparked debates. But eventually it faded into the background noise of strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena that accumulate at the edges of human experience. In the years that followed, other mysteries would emerge from the Atchafalaya Basin. A fisherman would find a rusted anchor tangled in chains at the bottom of a channel that hadn't existed on any map. A researcher studying wetland erosion would discover what appeared to be stone foundations in a section of swamp that had supposedly been underwater for thousands of years. Each discovery added to the sense that the Louisiana wetlands contained layers of history and strangeness that defied simple categorization. But none of these later mysteries carried quite the same emotional weight as Jackson Whitley's story, because none of them had a face, a family, a community that had been waiting 15 years for answers. Dr. Patricia Nguyen eventually published her findings in several peer-reviewed journals, carefully avoiding speculation about how Jackson had entered the sealed chamber. She focused on the archaeological significance of the mound itself, on what it revealed about pre-Columbian construction techniques and ceremonial practices. But in private conversations with colleagues, after a few drinks at academic conferences, she would sometimes admit that the Terrebonne Parish excavation had fundamentally changed her understanding of what was possible. She'd spent her career studying ancient cultures through the material remains they left behind, interpreting fragments of pottery and patterns of post holes to reconstruct how people lived and what they believed. The sealed chamber taught her that there were limits to that understanding, boundaries beyond which even the most rigorous scientific methodology couldn't penetrate. Raymond Boudreau died in his sleep on a cold February morning, surrounded by the case files he'd never been able to let go of completely. His daughter found him in his favorite chair, a folder labeled Whitley, Jackson T, open on his lap. She'd tried for years to get him to put the old cases aside, to enjoy his retirement, to stop haunting himself with questions that had no answers. But she understood, in a way, that those unsolved cases were part of his identity, the price he paid for a career spent pursuing truth and justice. At his funeral, Gabrielle Landry delivered a eulogy, speaking about Raymond's dedication and integrity, about the standard he'd set for everyone who followed him into law enforcement. She didn't mention Jackson Whitley by name, but everyone in attendance knew which case she meant when she talked about mysteries that tested the limits of understanding. The final chapter of this story, if it can be called final when so much remains unexplained, belongs to the land itself. The Atchafalaya Basin continues its slow transformation, shaped by sediment deposition and water flow, by hurricanes and droughts, by the complex interaction of natural processes and human intervention. The mound where Jackson Whitley was found stands, as it has stood for more than 1,000 years, a testament to the people who built it and the purposes they intended it to serve. Whether those purposes somehow extended across centuries to encompass the fate of a 17-year-old boy from Terrebonne Parish is a question that exists beyond the realm of evidence and proof in the space where mystery becomes permanent. Years later, when Gabrielle Landry had children of her own, they would sometimes ask her about the strangest case she'd ever worked. She would tell them about Jackson Whitley, carefully editing the details to be age-appropriate, focusing on the mystery rather than the tragedy. Her children would ask the same questions everyone asked. How did he get inside? What happened to him? Was it magic? And Gabrielle would give them the same answer she'd given herself countless times. Some questions don't have answers. Some mysteries are meant to remind us that the world is larger and stranger than we can fully comprehend. It wasn't the answer her children wanted, and it wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was the only honest response she could offer. The story of Jackson Whitley spread far beyond Terrebonne Parish, becoming part of the larger collection of American mysteries that captivate the public imagination. It appeared in books about unexplained disappearances, in documentaries about archaeological anomalies, in online forums where people debated every conceivable theory. Some believed it was proof of time travel or parallel dimensions. Others suggested elaborate hoaxes, though they could never explain how such a hoax could have been executed. The more prosaic explanations, involving underground cavities or undetected tomb robbing, failed to account for the physical evidence. Whatever the truth, Jackson Whitley's name became synonymous with the unknowable, a reminder that even in an age of satellite imaging and DNA analysis, the world still harbored secrets that resisted all attempts at revelation. Diana Whitley's estate, when she finally passed, included boxes of letters she'd written to Jackson over the 15 years between his disappearance and his discovery, and then continuing for the 7 years until her own death. She'd never mailed them, of course, because there was nowhere to send them, but she'd written them anyway, documenting the daily rhythms of life in the bayou, sharing news about neighbors and seasonal changes, telling him about his father's death and her own slowly accumulating years. The letters were discovered by a cousin who was clearing out the house, and after some discussion among the remaining family members, they decided to donate them to the Louisiana State Archives, where they became part of the permanent collection documenting life in the bayou parishes during the early 21st century. Researchers who read those letters found in them a portrait of grief that was both specific and universal, the story of a mother who refused to stop being a mother even when her child was gone. Diana wrote about her dreams, about the ways she imagined Jackson's final moments, about her desperate need to believe that he hadn't been afraid or in pain. She wrote about the community that had sustained her, the small kindnesses that had made survival possible. And in the letters written after Jackson's discovery, she wrestled with the impossible circumstances of his death, trying to find meaning or purpose in mystery, ultimately accepting that some questions would follow her to her own grave. The sealed chamber in the mound was eventually filled in and covered, deemed too fragile and too controversial to leave accessible. The research teams moved on to other projects, other sites, other questions that had clearer pathways to answers. But the story lingered, passed down through families and fishing communities, becoming part of the oral tradition of the Atchafalaya Basin. Old men in bait shops would tell it to young boys learning to navigate the channels, using it as a cautionary tale about respecting the swamp's power and mystery. Teachers would mention it in history classes when discussing Louisiana's pre-Columbian cultures, offering it as an example of how the past and present sometimes intersect in unexpected ways. On quiet evenings, when fog rolled in from the Gulf and settled over the bayou country, people would sometimes stand at the edges of the wetlands and wonder about Jackson Whitley. They would wonder if he'd known somehow that his disappearance would become a story that outlived him, that shocked the world and challenged assumptions about time and space and possibility. They would wonder if, in his final moments, he'd found some strange comfort in the darkness of that ancient chamber, or if he'd died confused and terrified, calling for his parents, desperate to understand what was happening. These were questions without answers, meditations that led nowhere except deeper into mystery. The world moved on, as it always does. New mysteries emerged, new tragedies demanded attention, new scientific discoveries challenged understanding in different ways. But in Terrebonne Parish, among the people who lived their lives in the shadow of the Atchafalaya Basin, Jackson Whitley's story remained present, a reminder that the land they called home was older and stranger than the houses they built on it, than the roads they cut through it, than the stories they told about it. The swamp had existed long before humans arrived and would exist long after they departed, indifferent to their need for explanation and closure. In the end, what shocked the world about Jackson Whitley's story wasn't just the impossible circumstances of his discovery, but what those circumstances revealed about the limits of human understanding. Despite all the technology and expertise brought to bear on the case, despite the careful analysis and rigorous investigation, the central mystery remained intact. How a 17-year-old boy from Louisiana ended up inside a chamber sealed for more than 1,000 years was a question that existed beyond the reach of science or logic, in the realm where fact becomes legend and mystery becomes permanent. It was a story that reminded everyone who encountered it that the universe still held secrets, that the boundary between the known and unknowable was thinner than comfortable rationality preferred to admit, and that some disappearances lead not to endings, but to questions that echo across generations, forever unanswered, forever unsettling, forever shocking in their stubborn refusal to resolve.